In a small, sun-baked town where the heat shimmered off the asphalt, and the biggest event of the week was the Friday night high school football game. A young man named Leo was chasing a dream that felt as out of place as a snowflake in the desert. His dream wasn't of a new truck or a ticket out of town for college. It was of a heavy, gleaming trophy, the kind you saw in glossy photos online, awarded to the winner of the prestigious Southwest Guitar Showdown. To Leo, that trophy wasn't just metal and wood. It was proof. It was a voice that could finally say, "You were wrong about me." The problem was, Leo didn't learn guitar the way you were supposed to. He lived in a world where the right way was the only way, and that way led directly to the door of Victor Salazar. Mr. Salazar was a local legend, a stern man with silver hair who had produced a lineage of competition winners. His students walked around town with a certain air, their expensive guitars tucked into pristine cases, their fingers moving with a clean, disciplined precision that Leo could only admire from afar. A single lesson with Mr. Salazar cost $100. For Leo, who stocked shelves at the local grocery store after school, that was more than 2 full days of work. It was an impossible price, so Leo built his own school. His classroom was his small bedroom, a space that smelled of old wood, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of his mom's lemon pledge. The walls were a collage of his life. Peeling posters of guitar gods he'd never met, Tommy Emmanuel with his kind eyes, Paco de Lucia looking intense and fierce were taped up next to a framed photo of his grandparents. His desk was a chaotic landscape of knowledge. A laptop, its case cracked and held together with a strip of silver duct tape, sat in the center. It was his gateway to the world. Stacked around it were notebooks filled with his messy handwriting, a strange language of scribbled tabs, chord diagrams, and music theory notes he'd painstakingly copied from a dozen different sources. This was his university, and the professors were a global collection of strangers he'd never met. He wasn't just a passive viewer. He was an active student, a detective of sound. His nights were spent hunched over the glowing screen, his face illuminated by the light of a YouTube video. He'd find an old, grainy clip of a blues player from Chicago, his fingers flying across the fretboard in a blur. Leo would watch it once, just to feel the music. Then he'd watch it again, and again, and again. He'd drag the cursor to the tricky part, a run of notes that sounded like a cascade of water, and he'd slow it down. First to half speed, then to a quarter. The sound would become a low, guttural groan, but now he could see it. He could see exactly how the player's thumb moved, how his pinky barely brushed the string, the subtle angle of his wrist. He didn't just copy. He understood. He'd open another tab, pulling up a video from a cheerful music theory professor in Sweden who explained circle of fifths with bright animated graphics. Leo would connect the dots, applying the professor's theory to the blues riff he was learning. Then, he might watch a video of a flamenco dancer in Seville, her feet stomping out a complex rhythm, and he'd try to translate that percussive energy onto the wooden body of his own guitar. He was creating his own style, a patchwork quilt of sound stitched together from threads all over the world. It was a fusion of American folk, Spanish flamenco, Brazilian rhythm, and classical theory, all filtered through the mind of a boy from a dusty desert town. His guitar was his constant companion. It wasn't a fancy brand-name instrument. It was a beat-up acoustic his dad had bought him from a pawn shop years ago, before he left for good. The wood was worn smooth in places where Leo's arm rested. It had a small, circular scratch near the sound hole from a time he'd accidentally dropped it. But to Leo, it was perfect. It had soul. He could feel the history in its worn frets, and he was adding his own story to it every day. His family didn't quite get it. His mom would poke her head into his room sometimes, her brow furrowed with a mix of love and worry. "Leo, mijo, it's getting late. Don't you have to work tomorrow?" she'd asked, her eyes soft. She loved his passion, but she also worried about his future. To her, a guitar was a hobby, not a career path. His friends were even less understanding. They'd call him on a Friday night, their voices crackling with excitement over the phone. "Leo, we're all going to the lake. You coming?" He'd have to say no, his eyes still glued to the laptop screen. "Can't, guys. I'm working on this one passage. The silence on the other end would say it all. They thought he was crazy, wasting his youth cooped up in his room. Sometimes, late at night, when his fingers were sore and his frustration was at its peak, he wondered if they were right. He'd try a particularly difficult piece, a piece that required his fingers to move in ways they didn't want to, and he'd fail again and again. The notes would come out clumsy, a jumbled mess, instead of the flowing melody he heard in his head. In those moments, the doubt would creep in, cold and sharp. He'd picture Mr. Salazar's students, with their perfect posture and effortless technique, and he'd feel a pang of insecurity. He was just a kid with a borrowed laptop and a dream, he taught himself. Who was he kidding? But then, something would click. After an hour of struggling with a single chord transition, he'd finally get it. His fingers would find the right position, and the sound would ring out clear and true. In that moment, all the frustration would melt away, replaced by a pure, unadulterated joy. It was a feeling of connection, of speaking a language that transcended words. It was just him and the six strings, creating something beautiful out of silence. It was in these moments that he knew he was on the right path, no matter how unconventional it seemed. He wasn't just learning to play notes. He was learning to tell his own story, one chord at a time. And the Southwest Guitar Showdown was the place where he was determined to finally share that story with the world. The day of the preliminary workshops felt like stepping into another world. The music hall where they were held wasn't like the dusty community center back home. This place was clean and modern, with polished wood floors that gleamed under bright track lighting and the faint, expensive smell of new carpet. Leo walked in, his worn-out guitar case held tight in his hand like a shield, and immediately felt out of place. All around him, kids his age or younger, moved with an easy confidence. They laughed in tight-knit groups, their expensive guitars in cases that looked brand new, slung over their shoulders like fashion accessories. They wore t-shirts from exclusive music camps and talked about people and things Leo had only read about online. They all shared one thing in common. They were students of Victor Salazar. You could see it in the way they held themselves, a certain disciplined posture, quiet pride in being part of the master's circle. Leo found a quiet corner in the back, hoping to be invisible. He unzipped his case and pulled out his beat-up acoustic, the one with the small scratch near the sound hole. Just holding it made him feel a little more grounded, a little more like himself. He needed to warm up his fingers, to shake off the nervous energy that was making his hands feel clumsy. He didn't want to play anything fancy, nothing that would draw attention. He just wanted to get comfortable. So he closed his eyes and started playing a piece he'd been working on for weeks. It wasn't a classical piece or a well-known song. It was a complex rhythmic pattern he'd learned from a video of a street musician in Brazil. The man had been playing a simple four-string guitar, but the rhythm he created with his thumb and fingers was incredible. A percussive, driving beat that made you want to tap your feet. Leo had spent hours slowing down the video, trying to mimic the way the musician's hand became a one-man band. A blend of melody and rhythm poured out of one instrument. He was so lost in the music, in the challenge of making his own fingers recreate that magic, that he didn't notice the small group that had gathered near him. He was just getting to the tricky part, a syncopated beat, where he had to tap the body of the guitar while simultaneously plucking a bass line. When a sharp, barking laugh cut through his concentration, Leo's eyes flew open. Standing there with his arms crossed and a smirk plastered on his face was Julian. Julian was Salazar's star pupil, a young man whose technical skill was legendary in these circles. He was flanked by a couple of his friends, who were trying and failing to hide their own smirks. "Sounds like someone's been studying at YouTube University," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. His friends let out a snort of laughter. The comment hit Leo like a physical blow. It was exactly what he was afraid of. It was the secret shame he carried, now spoken out loud for everyone to hear. He felt his face get hot. Julian looked Leo up and down, his gaze lingering on Leo's scuffed shoes and then on the worn-out guitar case on the floor beside him. "It's cute," Julian added, turning to his friends. "Trying to play percussion on an acoustic. My teacher says that's what amateurs do when they can't play real music." The laughter grew a little louder, and a few other people in the area turned to look. their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. Leo's first instinct was to just pack up and leave. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He felt small and foolish, a kid from a dusty town pretending to be a musician. But he didn't move. He just sat there, his fingers frozen on the fretboard, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched Julian and his group walk away, still laughing. And a different feeling started to bubble up inside him, hot and sharp. It wasn't shame anymore. It was anger. The humiliation wasn't over. Later in the day, there was a group session led by the man himself, Victor Salazar. He moved through the room with an aura of quiet authority. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He would stop by a student, listen for a moment, and offer a critique that was always precise, sometimes harsh, but undeniably brilliant. When he got to Julian, he listened to him play a lightning-fast classical piece. When Julian finished, Salazar nodded slowly. "Excellent," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Your arpeggios are the textbook definition of precision. That is disciplined playing." Julian practically glowed. Then Salazar's gaze swept the room and landed on Leo, was trying to make himself as small as possible. Salazar didn't walk over to him. He didn't even address him directly. Instead, he turned to the small panel of judges who were observing the workshop and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "You see," he said, gesturing vaguely in Leo's direction, "this is what I mean about undisciplined learning. Passion without structure is just noise. It leads to interesting, but ultimately flawed, interpretations. You get bad habits, habits that are almost impossible to break. It's a tragedy, really. It's a wave of knowing laughter rippled through the hall. It wasn't just Julian and his friends this time. It was the whole room. It was a public execution. Salazar had just held Leo up as an example of failure, a cautionary tale for everyone else. Leo felt the last bit of his confidence crumble into dust. He couldn't breathe. He quickly and quietly packed up his guitar, not even waiting for the session to end. He fled the main hall and found a small, unused practice room, closing the door behind him and sinking to the floor. For a long time, he just sat there in the dim light, his guitar in his lap, his hands trembling. He thought about just getting in his car and driving home, forgetting the whole stupid competition. Maybe they were all right. Maybe he was just a joke, but as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, the anger from earlier returned, stronger this time. He thought about the hours he had spent, the dedication, the love he had for the music. He thought about the old bluesman and the Brazilian street musician and the Swedish professor. They weren't noise. They were his teachers. And what he played wasn't flawed. It was his. He looked down at his guitar, at the worn wood and the familiar scratch. He had poured his soul into this instrument. He wasn't going to let a room full of arrogant people take that away from him. A slow, steady resolve began to harden inside him. They could laugh. They could whisper. They could call him a joke. But he was going to get on that stage and play. And he was going to show them all what YouTube University could really do. The final open rehearsal before the main competition was set to be a public event. It wasn't the big show, not yet, but it was close enough. It was being held in the main auditorium, a much larger and more intimidating space than the workshop rooms. A small audience had gathered a few parents, some music students from a local college, and most importantly, the entire panel of judges sat in the front row, their notebooks open and their expressions serious. For Leo, walking onto that stage felt like walking into a courtroom where he was already guilty. He clutched his guitar case, the duct-taped laptop in his backpack, feeling like a lead weight. A reminder of his unconventional crime, he found a seat with the other contestants in the wings, off to the side of the stage. The air was thick with a mixture of nerves and confidence. Julian was there, of course, holding court. He was tuning his gleaming high-end guitar, beautiful instrument that looked like it had never been played outside of a pristine room. He was surrounded by his friends, and their laughter echoed in the cavernous space. Each sound a tiny pinprick against Leo's fragile confidence. Leo tried to ignore them, focusing on the worn wood of his own guitar case, tracing the familiar scratches with his finger. He tried to summon the anger that had fueled him in the practice room, the fire that had made him want to prove them all wrong. But here, in the bright lights and the shadow of the stage, that fire felt small and distant, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The rehearsal was Victor Salazar's show. He walked onto the center of the stage, not to the podium, but right into the performance space. He didn't need a microphone. His voice was clear and commanding, filling every corner of the quiet hall. He wasn't just there to oversee. He was there to teach, to demonstrate his mastery. He moved from student to student, calling them up one by one. Each one was one of his own. They would play a short piece, and Salazar would listen, his head cocked, his eyes closed. Then he would offer a critique, always public, always sharp. "You're rushing the cadence," he'd tell one girl. "Precision is everything. Without it, you have nothing." To another he'd say, "Your vibrato is too emotional. It lacks control. Music is about discipline, not just feeling." Each comment was a lesson not just for the student on stage, but for everyone watching. It was a masterclass in the Salazar method, technique over everything, control over passion. The audience nodded along, impressed by his expertise. The judges scribbled notes, their faces unreadable. Leo felt like he was watching an assembly line, and each student was a perfectly polished product, shaped by the same machine. Then it was Julian's turn. He walked to the center of the stage with an easy swagger, soaking in the attention. He began to play, and the sound that came out of his guitar was breathtaking. It was a piece by a classical composer, a whirlwind of notes so fast and complex it seemed impossible for human fingers. It was technically perfect. Every note was clear, every transition seamless. It was a display of incredible skill, a feat of athleticism on the strings. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, followed by enthusiastic applause from the small audience. Salazar allowed a small, proud smile to touch his lips. "Exemplary," he said, his voice ringing with approval. "That is the result of dedication. That is the result of proper guidance. Julian has not missed a single lesson in 5 years. He has practiced the scales I gave him until his fingers bled. He has sacrificed. That," Salazar said, gesturing to Julian, "is what it takes to be an artist." Julian beamed, his eyes finding Leo in the wings for just a second, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. Leo's heart sank. He felt like he was shrinking in his seat. He had never bled over his scales. He had learned from videos in his bedroom, for free. He had played because he loved it, not because someone was forcing him to sacrifice. According to Salazar, he wasn't an artist. He wasn't even trying. And then Salazar's eyes, sharp and piercing, found him. He didn't call Leo's name. He just pointed a finger in his direction. "You," he said, his voice losing its warmth and turning hard as stone. "The young man from the workshop. Come here." A jolt of pure panic shot through Leo. Every head in the wings turned to look at him. He felt his legs move as if on their own, carrying him out of the shadows and into the harsh spotlight. He stood before Salazar, clutching his guitar, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. "What are you planning to play for us?" Salazar asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't interested in the answer. "I have a piece I've been working on," Leo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Salazar waved a dismissive hand. No, let's not waste everyone's time with another interesting interpretation. Just play a G major scale for me. A simple, 1-octave scale." Leo's blood ran cold. A scale. It was the most basic thing a guitarist could learn. It was an insult. He knew this was a trap. He positioned his fingers on the fretboard, his hand trembling so badly he was afraid he'd drop the guitar. He took a breath and began to play. The notes came out, but they were shaky, his nervousness making his fingers fumble. It wasn't perfect. He stopped, his face burning with shame. Salazar didn't even look at him. He turned to the audience and the judges, using Leo as a prop in his own lecture. "You see?" he said, his voice booming with false pity. "You see the damage? This is what I was talking about. This is the result of YouTube University. He has learned bits and pieces, flashy tricks, with no foundation. His hand position is wrong. His timing is off. These are not small mistakes. These are fundamental flaws, bad habits that are now deeply ingrained. It is almost impossible to come back from this. A wave of knowing laughter and murmurs rippled through the hall. It was worse than the workshop. This time, it was in front of everyone. The judges were looking at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Julian was trying and failing to hide a huge, triumphant grin. The humiliation was absolute. It was a public execution of his dream, of his very identity as a musician. Salazar's words were like physical blows, each one chipping away at what little confidence he had left. Passion without structure is just noise, Salazar concluded, his final word on the matter. Thank you. You may go. Leo didn't remember walking off the stage. He didn't remember grabbing his case. The next thing he knew, he was outside, the cool night air hitting his burning face. He didn't stop walking. He just kept going, past the parking lot, down the street, until the lights of the music hall were just a distant glow. He found a bench in a small, deserted park and sank onto it, his guitar case beside him. For the first time, he truly believed they were right. He was a fraud. He was a joke. He had wasted years of his life on a foolish fantasy. He opened the case and looked at his guitar, his old beat-up friend. For the first time, it didn't look like a source of magic. It just looked like a pile of wood and strings. He felt a tear roll down his cheek, then another. He was utterly, completely broken. The park bench felt cold and unforgiving beneath him, a stark contrast to the warm, familiar comfort of his bedroom where this whole journey had begun. For a long time, Leo just sat there, staring at the guitar case lying beside him like a fallen soldier. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and the distant hum of traffic was the only sound. The humiliation from the auditorium felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Every word Salazar had said echoed in his mind. Fundamental flaws, bad habits, noise. He wasn't a musician. He was a cautionary tale. He thought about just getting up, walking to his beat-up car, and driving home. He could delete his bookmarks, throw his notebooks away, and just be Leo, the kid who stocked shelves at the grocery store. It would be simpler. It would be easier. He reached over and rested his hand on the hard shell of the guitar case. The worn-out handle felt familiar under his palm. He thought about all the hours this case had been open, the music that had poured out of it. He thought about the joy he felt when he finally nailed a difficult passage. The way the world would fade away until it was just him and the 6 strings. Was that all a lie? Was it just noise? A memory surfaced, unbidden. It was from a video he'd watched 100 times. An old black-and-white interview with a bluesman from the Deep South, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and hard living. The man had been asked about his technique, about his bad habits of not following the rules. The old man had just chuckled and said, in a gravelly voice, "Son, the technical stuff is just the skeleton. The music is the soul you pour into it. You can have the perfect skeleton, but if there's no soul inside, it's just a bunch of bones." The words hit Leo with the force of a revelation. That was it. That was the difference. Salazar and his students were creating perfect skeletons. They were technically flawless, disciplined, and precise. But where was the soul? Where was the story? Leo's music wasn't perfect. It was messy, a patchwork of a dozen different influences. But it was his. Every note he played had a memory attached to it, the Brazilian street musician, the Swedish professor, the old bluesman. He had poured his own soul, his own story, into every chord. Salazar saw it as flawed because it didn't fit his rigid definition of music. But maybe it wasn't flawed. Maybe it was just real. A slow, quiet resolve began to replace the cold dread in his chest. He stood up, his movements feeling more deliberate. He wasn't doing this for the trophy anymore. He wasn't doing this to prove Salazar wrong. He was doing it for the old bluesman. He was doing it for himself. He was going to get on that stage and play his music with all its flaws and all its soul. If they hated it, so be it. At least it would be true. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric, with nervous energy. The air buzzed with the sound of tuning strings and anxious chatter. Leo moved through the crowd like a ghost, his mind clear and focused. He saw Julian holding court, polishing his gleaming guitar with a soft cloth, his friends hanging on his every word. Julian glanced up and saw Leo, and a cruel smirk played on his lips. He was expecting to see a broken boy, and he was ready to enjoy his victory. But he didn't see that. He saw something else in Leo's eyes, a calmness he couldn't understand, and his smirk faltered for just a second. Leo just nodded once, a simple, neutral gesture, and found a quiet corner to wait. He closed his eyes, not to practice, but just to listen. He could hear the music in his head, the story he was about to tell. Then, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, calling the next contestant. One by one, they went out. One by one, they came back. Then, it was his turn. And now, let's welcome Leo Martinez to the stage. Leo walked out of the wings and into the blinding spotlight. The sea of faces was a blur, but he could feel the weight of their expectations. He could feel the skeptical eyes of the judges, the smug gaze of Julian watching from the wings. He walked to the center of the stage and sat on the single stool, placing his worn-out guitar on his lap. It felt like an old friend. He didn't acknowledge the audience. He didn't say a word. He just closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and let his fingers find the strings. He began to play. The first note was soft, almost hesitant. It wasn't a scale or a classical arpeggio. It was a simple, haunting melody, a sound that seemed to come from a different time and place. It was the folk influence, the storytelling style he'd learned from an old Appalachian player online. The melody was lonely and beautiful, and a hush fell over the auditorium. The whispering stopped. People leaned forward in their seats. This wasn't what they were expecting. Then he began to weave in the rhythm. His thumb started a steady, percussive beat on the lower strings, while his fingers plucked out a delicate, intricate melody on top. It was the Brazilian rhythm, the one Julian had mocked. But now, in the context of the haunting melody, it wasn't a gimmick. It was the heartbeat of the song, a pulse that gave the music life and urgency. He saw the judges exchange a look. Their professional curiosity piqued. Slowly, he began to build. He introduced a flourish of flamenco phrasing, a series of rapid emotional notes that cried out with passion. Then, he'd slide back into the blues, bending a string with a raw, guttural feeling that spoke of hardship and hope. He was creating a tapestry of sound, a mosaic of all the teachers he'd ever known. It was complex and unpredictable, but it was seamless. His technique was unorthodox, his hand position not the textbook perfect way, but his fingers moved with a confidence and a purpose that was undeniable. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story. It was the story of his dream, of his doubt, of his humiliation, and of his quiet. Stubborn resolve, the smirks were long gone. Julian's jaw was slack, his face a mask of disbelief. He was looking at Leo's hands, trying to understand how they could be creating such a sound. It defied everything he had been taught. The judges had put down their pens. They were no longer critiquing. They were just listening, completely captivated. The music swelled, rising to a crescendo of raw, powerful emotion. A whirlwind of rhythm and melody that was both technically brilliant and deeply soulful. It was controlled chaos, a perfect storm of sound. Then, as suddenly as it had exploded, the music softened. He brought it back down to the single, haunting melody from the beginning. He played it once more, slower this time, with a sense of peace. He struck the final, resonating chord and let it hang in the air. A single, perfect sound that seemed to hold all the emotion of the piece. There was a moment of absolute, stunned silence. The entire auditorium was frozen, holding its breath, the final note still vibrating in the air. It lasted for 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a thunderous, deafening ovation. People were on their feet, cheering and whistling. The sound washed over Leo, a wave of pure, unadulterated acceptance. He opened his eyes and looked out at the standing crowd, his own heart pounding. He hadn't won yet, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had shared his soul, and for the first time, they had truly listened. The sound was a physical thing, a wall of noise that hit Leo with the force of a tidal wave. For a moment, he just sat there on the stool, his guitar still resting on his lap, his mind struggling to catch up. The faces in the crowd were a blur of light and shadow, all of them on their feet. Their mouths open in a way that looked like shouting, but sounded like a single, continuous roar. It was the kind of applause you heard in movies, the kind you thought was just added for effect. It couldn't be real. He had played his music, the messy, patchwork quilt of sound he had stitched together in his bedroom, and they were cheering. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he were watching this happen to someone else. Slowly, he stood up. His legs felt shaky, like they might not hold him. He gave a small, awkward bow, not really knowing what else to do. The cheering only grew louder. He turned and walked off the stage, his movements feeling stiff and robotic. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different from the one he had left just 10 minutes ago. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by a buzzing, electric shockwave. The other contestants, the ones who had ignored him or whispered about him, were now looking at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A few of them even clapped him on the back as he walked by, some murmuring words he couldn't quite hear over the ringing in his ears. He saw Julian standing by the wall alone. His group of friends had scattered. Julian wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't looking triumphant. He was just staring, his face pale, his expensive guitar hanging forgotten at his side. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. When their eyes met, Julian didn't look away. He just held Leo's gaze, and in his eyes Leo saw not hatred, but a deep, profound confusion. His entire world, built on the foundation of Salazar's teachings, had just been shaken to its core, and he didn't know how to process it. Leo just gave him a small, almost sad nod before finding a quiet corner to lean against the wall. He closed his eyes, trying to slow his pounding heart. He had done it. He had played his truth. Now came the hardest part, the waiting. An official came and collected all the contestants, leading them to a small room backstage to wait for the judge's final decision. The air was thick with tension. No one spoke much. Leo just sat on a folding chair, his guitar case on his lap, his hands still trembling slightly. He could hear the muffled voice of the announcer on stage, thanking the audience for their patience. He tried not to think about the outcome. He had already won, in a way. He had proven to himself that his music had value, that his soul wasn't just noise. But still, a part of him, a small, hopeful boy from a dusty town, desperately wanted to hear his name called. He wondered what was happening in the judge's room. He pictured them sitting around a table, the scorecards in front of them. He could almost imagine the conversation. One of the older, more traditional judges, probably a friend of Salazar's, would be arguing for technical precision. Julian's performance was flawless, the judge might say, a perfect execution of a difficult piece. That has to count for something. But then he imagined another judge, maybe a younger one, shaking her head. Flawless. Yes. But it was empty. It was a perfect skeleton. The other boy, Leo. His performance was messy. His technique was unorthodox. But it was alive. It had a story. It had soul. Isn't that what art is supposed to be about? Leo hoped the second judge was winning the argument. He even pictured Victor Salazar in that room, sitting silently, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betraying a storm of bewilderment. The man who had built his reputation on structure and discipline had just been confronted by the raw, untamed power of passion, and he had no answer for it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the waiting room opened. An official with a clipboard told them it was time to go back out on stage. They lined up, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. Leo's heart was hammering against his ribs again. He walked out into the bright lights, the roar of the crowd greeting them once more. The announcer was at the podium, a golden envelope in his hand. He smiled at the contestants, a practiced, professional smile. "This has been an incredible night of music," he began, his voice echoing through the hall. The judges had a very difficult decision. Every one of these young musicians is exceptionally talented, but there can only be one winner. He paused for dramatic effect, and the audience leaned in, a collective intake of breath. "We will start by announcing our third place winner. He tore open the envelope. The third place prize goes to a very talented musician, Alina Rodriguez. Polite applause went up. Alina, one of Salazar's students, stepped forward. Her face a picture of disappointment, but she accepted her small trophy gracefully. Leo's stomach tightened. 2 spots left. And now, the announcer continued, for our second place finalist, he took another envelope. This was an extremely close call. The runner-up for this year's Southwest Guitar Showdown is Julian Reyes. Confused, hesitant applause rippled through the crowd. Julian looked absolutely stunned. He walked forward as if in a trance, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come here expecting first place. To him, second was a complete failure. He snatched the trophy from the announcer and walked off the stage without a word. The tension in the auditorium was now so thick you could feel it. If Julian was second and Alina was third, that meant only one person was left. The announcer let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. He looked out at the audience, then at the lone figure standing in the center of the stage. He smiled, a genuine warm smile this time. It is my great honor to announce the winner of the 2023 Southwest Guitar Showdown. It's the recipient of the first place trophy and the grand prize, Leo Martinez. The world exploded. The sound that erupted from the crowd was louder than anything Leo had ever heard. It was a joyous, deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. For a second, Leo just stood there, his mind completely blank. His name? They had said his name. He felt a hand on his back, gently guiding him forward. He walked to the podium in a daze, his feet not feeling like they were touching the ground. The announcer placed the heavy gleaming trophy into his hands. It was real. The cool metal felt solid and heavy in his grip. He looked out at the sea of faces, all of them smiling, all of them cheering for him. His eyes scanned the crowd and found Victor Salazar. The great teacher was standing in the aisle, not clapping, not smiling, just staring. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked lost. He looked like a man who had spent his life building a house, only to realize he had forgotten to build a foundation. It was a look of profound, life-altering bewilderment. After the ceremony, as Leo was trying to navigate the crowd of well-wishers, a reporter with a microphone and a camera crew stopped him. "Leo, that was an incredible performance," the reporter said, her voice full of excitement. "Everyone is asking, who is your teacher? Who is the master who trained you to play like that?" Leo looked down at the trophy in his hands, at his own reflection distorted in its polished surface. He thought about the long nights in his bedroom, the grainy YouTube videos, the old bluesman, Swedish professor, the Brazilian street musician. He thought about the journey, the doubt, the humiliation, and the final, triumphant joy. He looked back at the reporter, and a small, genuine smile spread across his face. "I had a lot of great teachers," he said, his voice clear and steady. "They just didn't know they were teaching me." In that moment, holding the trophy that was once an impossible dream, he knew he hadn't just won a competition. He had won validation for every person who ever dared to learn differently, whoever followed a passion that others didn't understand. He had one for the soul, poured into 6 strings of worn-out wood.